G'day, I'm Paul Rowe. You're in my workspace, so welcome. You can see behind me, this is my toolkit really. These books, full of stories, have been my toolkit for a long time now. So I've used stories in all sorts of places, and I want to tell you how stories have affected my life. I've been a teacher, a pastor, a tourist officer. I've told stories in pubs. This little bell here, for example, it's a horse bell. If you read the print, you can't, but it says that I won a yarn spinning competition. So in the back of a pub. So stories have been a big part of my life. I've been broadcasting on radio. I've done documentaries, all sorts of stuff. And stories are my stock and trade. And I just love stories, and I love telling stories. There's a bit of magic I want to tell you about. That it says that when I start telling you a story, something magical happens in your brain. It's got a technical expression. It's called neural entrainment. And it's the only thing that does this in your brain. Your brain waves are going along, and if we're in a group, we're all talking and the brain waves are all going in different directions. But as soon as somebody starts telling a story and people start to listen to the story, all the brain waves in the room get into sync, which is an amazing thing, isn't it? Only stories do that. And I wonder whether that's a clue as to the power of stories, because wherever you go, it doesn't matter whether you're a manager in a business or you're a truck driver or a teacher or whatever, stories are going to be an important part of what you do, and the way you tell stories will be an important part of what you do. So I want to take you back into my own personal story, and it started way back with my dad telling me stories about my grandfather. And on my iPad, I've got a picture of my grandfather here. I don't know whether you can see that. And it goes back, it's an old picture, but back in the 1930s maybe. And there he is sitting in a park with a bunch of kids, and guess what he's doing? He's telling stories. And whenever I meet old people who knew my grandfather, they used to say, "Oh, Mr. Rowe, yeah, you'd see him on the way home from the coal mines where he worked, and the afternoons, and if he had a chance, he'd gather a group of kids around him in the gutter and they'd sit down together and he'd tell them a Bible story." Now, that's an interesting thing, and that got me interested about what was it that touched my grandfather's life with stories. Well, I've got two cousins who've tracked family history back, and they've gone back, one went back to England, one back to Scotland, and they found out information about our family. You could do that with your family too. With my dad's family, they found that he came from England as a young boy. That's a picture of him there with his dad and his sister. And there's a sad thing in the picture here. You can see that there's a figure missing. The mother is missing. That's because my grandfather James had only just arrived here with his mum, and she died 2 weeks later. And previous to coming to Australia, they'd lost two other children. So in his life, there was this sort of loss, that affected his heart, I'm sure. Very quickly, he was working in the mines under Stockton Harbour in Newcastle with his dad because they were a poor family. And then a mine disaster came, and so they moved away up to Queensland, went to the gold mines there, and then came back to Newcastle, where my grandmother and grandfather got married. There they are, back around 1900. And they weren't very wealthy, so they headed up to the goldfields near Armidale, and they were working in a mine. Let me see if I can find a picture of it like that. It's called the Hillgrove mine up near Armidale, up in the high country. And there they had a little baby boy, and he got to 2 years old, and then diphtheria came to town, an awful disease. And so this little boy, where did he go? There he is, Eric. He died of diphtheria, and so they were really sad. They lost their beautiful little boy, and it broke their hearts. And what they were looking for was a story that was going to explain to them how they could make sense of it. Would they see their little boy again? Was there life after death? All those kind of things. So they went to church, and one of the church people said, "Well, just keep coming to church." But fortunately, they met a Salvation Army girl who told them a story, the story of Jesus. And they said, "Yep, the story of Jesus has a powerful effect in assuring us that there is a heaven and you can meet your little boy again. So my grandfather became famous, I think. There's a picture of the little graveyard where my Uncle Eric was buried. But it didn't stop there, you see. And I'm sure that my grandfather, that affected him, you know. And so that's why he sat in the street telling stories to kids. And not just any stories, but he connected them to a story, a big story that made sense of all their little stories. And that's what I've spent my life doing. My dad did it too. So you see what I'm saying, how story can affect you? It gripped my grandfather's life and he became a storyteller with a purpose. And my dad too became a storyteller. He was great at telling Bible stories and other stories, and he was a lot of fun. And he passed that on to me, and I've tried to pass it on to my kids, that if you tell people a story, that magic happens. You know, their brainwaves get into sync. And particularly if you can link their little story, your little story, to God's big story, then somehow it all comes together. It kind of makes sense, and it's got a strong thing. So wherever you go in life, doesn't matter what you end up doing with your life, you are a storyteller. You got to spend a lot of your time telling stories, and the better you are at it, and the more you can make story make sense, particularly by joining it to God's big story, then you will see, you will find, you will discover for yourself just how powerful stories can be and how they can change people's lives. I've seen it. I've told so many stories in my life to people, and I've seen how it changes. If you tell them good stories, powerful stories, how it can change their life. I know it changed mine. So discovering my grandfather's journey and my dad's journey and mine explains how story has become such an important part of my toolkit and why I love to tell stories. And I hope you do too.